Welcome back to Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. My name is Tom, and I'll be your guide as we spend this episode exploring Chapter 6 of Wizard's First Rule. In our last episode, we covered Richard and Caelin's first night together and learned about the history of the Midlands, Darkenrall's invasion of it, and Caelin's mission to find the old wizard. Please note that these episodes contain spoilers, heavy spoilers, not just for this chapter, but for future chapters and books in the series. If you haven't read the series yet and you intend to, I'd encourage you to read the books first and then come back and see what I think about them. Spoiler alert, these books always make me happy when I read them. We begin the chapter with Richard and Caelin traveling to Zed's house at the beginning of Chapter 6. Best estimates place the time since the beginning of Wizard's First Rule on the second day. Richard recognizes that the bite from the vine is bringing on a fever. He also notes that it's getting worse and needs to go to Zed for help. Even the next day, Shar's warning to seek the answer or die echoes in Richard's mind. If her goal was to make Richard associate his survival with seeking the answer, then she succeeded. Goodkind once again reinforces the coming of winter by describing the chill breeze in the air. Caelin stops to pick some wildflowers next to a nearby stream as she arranges them in a small scoop-shaped piece of wood. Richard knows about a nearby apple tree, assumes she must be hungry, and goes apple picking. In addition to providing a source of valuable apples that will show up again and again throughout the rest of the book, this passage also shows Richard's comfort with nature. He is keenly aware of this area and knows enough about it to easily find the necessities of life such as food, water, and shelter. While Caelin is working on her floral arrangement, Richard fills his backpack half full of apples. Backpacks made for people who spend extended amounts of time in the woods are much larger than backpacks that are common in public and private education. Backpacks that are rated effective for the amount of time Richard is away from his home have a carrying capacity of 80 to 100 liters in volume. We're never given the exact dimensions of Richard's backpack, but based on his profession as a woods guide, it's safe to assume that the author is talking about one of the larger varieties. For purposes of this example, we will assume a more conservative 80-liter carrying capacity for Richard's backpack. In 2014, the European Journal of Science and Mathematics published an article investigating the use of apples to study the relationship between density and flotation. That study recorded a result of 150 to 200 cubic centimeters as the average volume of a single apple. As Richard's 80-liter pack is filled halfway with apples, then 40 liters of apples, with an average volume of 200 cubic centimeters each, translates to roughly 200 apples, having a total combined weight of approximately 80 pounds. An average apple tree can produce as many as 500 apples in one season. We're never told the exact variety of apple that Richard harvests, but we can narrow it down to a few likely suspects: the Red Delicious, the Gala, and the Rome apple. All three of them are good candidates because they match the color described in the book. Additionally, because Richard fills his backpack half full with them, we also know that the variety of apple that Richard picks must be one of the varieties that is somewhat resistant to bruising, which is consistent with the descriptions given for the properties of those apples by fresh fruit and vegetable industries. Richard has already established by cloning the Om plant that he is someone who doesn't take more from nature than he can use, and therefore Richard wouldn't take 80 pounds of apples if he didn't think they would survive the packing process. Of those three choices, the Rome apple seems to be the closest match to the words of the text. The Red Delicious apple and the Gala are both man-developed hybrids, and both varieties came after the Rome apple. There's very little mention in the Sword of Truth series of anything resembling the advanced horticulture techniques that are used to create new flavors of apples that we see today. Coincidentally, the point in time of early 1800s I used to calculate the value of gold coins in the Sword of Truth series is also the same period of time that the Rome apples were commercially developed. This is also implied from the narrative tone of Richard's reaction to apple trees, both in Wizard's First Rule and Faith of the Fallen. Each time Richard thinks about apple trees, it's from the perspective that they are a naturally occurring resource that can be gathered and moved, but not altered. However, to be fair, given Richard's harmony with nature, it is possible that as a biased narrator, he simply wouldn't recognize nature as something to be subjugated. Additionally, the Gala and Red Delicious apple are both seasonal during early and mid-September, whereas the Rome apple is seasonal during early and mid-October. In a cool, dark place, such as a backpack experiencing late fall and early winter temperatures, an apple can maintain its freshness and flavor for 6 to 9 months. At a rate of 1 apple per day, without giving any away, that would result in roughly a 7-month supply of apples. The fact that Richard knew the tree was there could be interpreted one of two ways. The first being the most innocent, that there was an apple tree and Richard often visited it to pick an apple or two. I'm more inclined to believe a second explanation that weighs the words about how many apples Richard took a bit more heavily. Given the Cipher family's relative debt-to-income ratio, and the versatility of apples being a long-lasting and delicious food, and Richard's previously noted habits of preparing things ahead of time for the future, combined with Richard's motto of always knowing where his next meal is going to come from, it makes sense to entertain the idea that this apple tree is part of a yearly routine that Richard goes through to provide himself with a free source of semi-perishable food for the upcoming winter months. Richard knows where the tree is because picking 80 pounds of apples and carrying them around is a memorable experience. Richard finishes picking apples before Kaylin finishes her floral arrangement. Finishing before her also reinforces the amount of apples calculated to have been taken by Richard. According to the article The Hard Labor of Apple Picking, written in October 2015 by the Smithsonian, a skilled apple harvester will be able to pick upwards of 12,000 pounds of apples in a single day at a rate of approximately 20 apples per minute. Even at a slower rate than the laborers who do this professionally, Richard would easily be able to pick 200 apples in less than 15 minutes. An article for WeddingBee.com states that depending on the level of complexity, a single floral arrangement can take anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours to create. After seeing the driftwood floral arrangement float away into a nearby brook, Kaylin tells Richard that she has prepared the flowers as an offering to the good spirits on behalf of their mission and in the memory of their mothers. In the Judeo-Christian Bible, flowers are referenced numerous times as a symbol for the beauty and the fleeting nature of our lives. They spring up like flowers and wither away, like fleeting shadows they do not endure. Kaylin becomes about Richard and asks him what is wrong. Richard lies to her by telling her nothing is the matter and tells her to eat an apple. Kaylin smacks Richard's hand away and grabs him by the throat. This video series will attempt to track the number of apples estimated to be inside Richard's backpack. This interaction brings the current total to 199. Kaylin makes Richard confused by yelling at him, and we're given another instance of Goodkind describing Richard's narration of an outside but unidentified force pulling him to a specific course of action when he says, "Something told him not to move." If you're making the argument that Richard's gift is far more active than the explicit mention of it would suggest, then narratively this interaction is consistent with other passages that make similar claims. While Richard wonders if Kaylin just really has a problem with apples, she explains that in the Midlands a spell was cast that made all red fruit poisonous to eat. Kaylin goes through the 5 stages of grief when she thinks that Richard is trying to poison her. She combines denial and anger in the same step when she says, "Why would you do this?" Bargaining occurs. Immediately after, Richard promises that apples are good to eat, and Kaylin responds by asking Richard if he eats these apples. Richard assures her that he does. We reach the stage of depression when Kaylin switches from anger to embarrassment, and then she releases Richard and apologizes, putting her own hand over her mouth to hide her embarrassment. Acceptance occurs when Richard makes her laugh about the entire misunderstanding. Notice how in this section, Kaylin experiences the stages of grief when she thinks Richard was trying to poison her. Her strong reaction isn't because of the importance of her mission or at the shock of an assassination attempt. As the mother confessor, she is used to having important missions and warding off violent attempts on her life. Kaylin's energetic response is due to a large jolt of cognitive dissonance. Kaylin's reality and what she thinks she knows to be true create a paradox. Kaylin knows Richard to be a good man who she trusts with her life. She also knows red fruit to be poison. Unable to rationalize the two facts, she sides with the assumption that Richard must be trying to poison her. The only way that explanation makes sense is if Richard was only pretending to be her friend, and even mentally entertaining that line of reasoning makes Kaylin feel as though she has just lost her only friend in the world that she ever had. A friend that she admitted in the last chapter meant more to her than she probably realizes at the moment. Richard takes a bite of the apple still in his hand and convinces her to try some, which she does. Kaylin then finishes her original thought when she puts her hand on Richard's forehead and notes that he's burning with fever. In retrospect, Richard displays a high tolerance for pain and a strong work ethic. Given that he commits to the laborious task of picking 80 pounds of apples and carrying them down a trail in the middle of a high fever, Richard and Kaylin make it to Zed's home. Zed's house is described as a modest in size with a sod-covered roof, complete with a ramp for his old cat to climb on top of it. A sod roof, or turf roof, traditional in Scandinavia, is a type of green roof covered with sod on top of several layers of birch bark on gently sloping wooden roof boards, like the extra one used to reference the ramp for Zed's aging cat. Until the late 19th century, it was the most common roof on rural log houses in Norway and large parts of the rest of Scandinavia, which is consistent with the assumptions made about the value of gold coins and the variety of apples that were most likely picked, given that they were roughly from the same period in time. Zed's cat is described as having a more difficult time getting down than he has going up. In the article Arthritis and Other Mobility Issues in Older Cats, written by PreventativeHealth.com, we learned that 90% of cats over the age of 12 have chronic arthritis pain. And as many pets get older, many owners make accommodations so their pets can more easily continue to reach the places of comfort they would often visit in their youth. We're then given the third symbol in this chapter meant to represent the fleeting and finite nature of life when we're given a description of Zed's flower box containing only withered and dead flowers. The first instance was Kaylin's floral arrangement of freshly picked flowers still vibrant and full of life. The second is a reference to Zed's aging cat, which is starting to slow down and reach the end of its natural life. And finally, the last stage of death and decay is described in neutral and casual language as being just another part of the natural order of things. We are introduced to Zed's reason chair, a place where he likes to sit while he is trying to figure out the reason for something. Richard remembers the story of the time Zed spent 3 days in his chair trying to figure out why people fight over how many stars they are. An article for Chante.com titled 11 Brilliant Problem-Solving Techniques Nobody Taught You, which is a title designed to gaslight you into feeling stupid if you do not go on to read the article, while at the same time creates a false flag by suggesting that the information contained within the article is well known but is purposefully being kept from you. This article tells the story of Yohire Nakamoto, an inventor with over 3,300 patents. He spends his time in a place he calls the Calm Room. It is a separately and specially designed bathroom lined with 24-karat gold, which acts as a Faraday cage, blocking out all television, Wi-Fi, and radio signals. He says the room helps inspire imagination when working on a specific problem. Numerous other sources suggest a change of physical location as an effective method of problem solving. He eventually decides it is because anyone can say they are an expert and it is impossible for them to be proven wrong. According to the University of California in Santa Barbara, current estimates are that the universe contains at least 100 billion trillion stars. That is a little bit more than the estimated number of grains of sand in all the beaches of all the world. Zed's conclusion is that men seek the validation of expertise without committing to the diligence of earning such a thing. Since it is unverifiable, it is easy to claim to be an expert and impossible to be proven wrong. We learn after that Zed ate in earnest for 3 hours. An article for theblast.com describes Joey Chestnut as being able to eat 75 hot dogs in 10 minutes. 75 hot dogs have a total weight of approximately 15 pounds. While we never learn what Zed ate during his 3-hour feast, given the repeated references about his character's relationship with food, it is safe to assume that it is a hefty amount, and that he might be able to give Joey Chestnut a run for his money. Richard and Kaylin walk behind Zed's house and find him standing on a rock, staring into the sky without any clothes on. We learn in Chapter 7 of Wizard's First Rule that Zed's cloud rock is actually a wizard's rock given to him by his father. Richard narrates that he's seen Zed use the rock many times growing up, and that the behavior wasn't strange, it was just a part of the old man's personality. This sentence reinforces Richard's reverent admiration for the qualities that make something unique, as established back in Chapter 4 with his squeaky chair. When Richard sees Zed, Goodkind sets up the first of a mirrored pair when he describes Zed as having his back arched, his arms stretched out to the sky with his head tilted back. Later on in Chapter 13, Richard completes this pair with his own body language when Zed allows Richard to stand on the wizard's rock. The author uses words to establish Zed as a fixed and stable point of self-identification. This is because all of his protagonists are symbolic relationships of the core virtues of objectivism. While all of the protagonists display a mix of these virtues, each one seems to personify one of those virtues above all others. Richard would be integrity, Kaylin would be justice, and Zed is pride. That is why Zed is introduced in the manner that he is. Not only is he naked, but he is unashamed by that and is described of having the body language that conveys absolute conviction that he is everything he needs to be, and that his satisfaction in himself is the only thing required for him to feel that way. Zed is described as a thin old man who is a lot tougher than he looks. The author reinforces Zed's pride by using a neutral tone when describing his physical characteristics. He's old, scrawny, plainly dressed, and has unkempt hair. The next sentence reveals that Zed knew that he was coming. That cements the fact that a person's sense of self-worth is not something that is given to him by anyone else, at least according to Zed. This shares the same structure as the rule of all rules, given to us in Confessor, the rule unwritten that knowledge is earned, not given. Self-esteem is built through pride, rooted in tangible growth, personal achievement, and good decisions made from reason rather than emotion. Since Zed is one of the core characters of the entire series, Goodkind treats this character's introduction similar to Richard's when he immediately follows up our first impression with a second interaction to fully cement Zed's personification of justifiable self-satisfaction. When Kaylin turns around from embarrassment and Richard picks up Zed's robe to dress him, both Richard and Kaylin's attempts to dress him are an assertion of modesty that is predicated on Zed's perceived moral obligation of modesty. Richard makes this claim when he gives Zed no other option to comply because they have company. Since Richard does not ask for Zed's consent in the matter, the old man pursues what he believes to be the wisest way to handle claims made against his own personal agency. Zed does not consent, but he also does not engage. Instead, Zed applies the Wizard's 13th rule, which states, "We cannot change the nature of humanity by force, violence, and imprisonment. The only effective course of action is rooted in truth and love," saying that any other method would be unsuccessful and would have the opposite effect, making the divide even deeper. Zed ignores Richard's attempts to dress him and asks Richard if he knew how he was coming. Richard correctly says that it has something to do with the cloud that has been following him and tells Zed to allow himself to be dressed by him. This is the second time Richard repeats his claim on Zed's life choices, and for a second time Zed does not engage with this interaction in any way. Instead, Zed tells Richard that the cloud has been following him for the last 3 weeks. He tells us he's been trying to find Richard since his father died. We later learn that Zed knows what a tracer cloud is, and given his knowledge of the Midlands, his direct interaction with Dahara during the war, and that he knows Darkenral is Richard's father, his sense of urgency makes a lot of sense. Since there is no magic in Westland, Zed would likely be aware that something must be wrong with the boundary, or that someone has used magic to cross through the boundary. Based on that information, it's reasonable to assume that the only explanations he could think of for why a tracer cloud was attached to Richard are all accompanied by a significant implication of danger. Finally, Richard asks Zed to hold up his arm so he can help him put his robe on. It is only then, when he is presented with a choice that is contingent upon his voluntary participation, that Zed allows himself to be dressed. Not because it is a moral imperative forced upon him, but because he was given a choice to do so and offered his consent. Zed asks Richard if he knew where the cloud was from, and Richard tells him to stop swearing and that he thinks it was from Dahara. For a third time, Zed ignores Richard's insistence that he must act a certain way, but does not ignore the facts contained in his response. Zed is the personification of a man who is completely at peace with who he is, and no one, not even someone who is very close to him, has the authority to challenge that. Zed accepts Richard's explanation of why he thinks it is from there and concludes that Richard must also know that a cloud from Dahara is bad news. Zed notices that Richard has a fever and asks Richard if he brought him anything to eat. Richard gives Zed an apple and brings the estimated total of apples left in Richard's backpack down to 198. Richard tells Zed he is in trouble while Zed performs a medical examination of Richard. Zed checks Richard's temperature, his eyes, and his pulse. Given the source of Richard's wound, the fact that there is a foreign body stuck inside him, Richard's symptoms of weakness, fever, sweating, chills, lightheadedness, and dizziness, he is most likely suffering from some sort of sepsis. Zed notes the fever and checks Richard's eyes for jaundice. Sepsis and bacterial infection are responsible for up to 20% of all instances of jaundice. Another symptom of sepsis is rapid heartbeat, found when Zed feels Richard's pulse. This diagnosis also gives a form of power scaling to Richard's physical capabilities, as he is able to carry over 100 pounds of gear despite his worsening symptoms. Zed declares that he will be unconscious soon, and Richard asks if Zed will be able to help him. Zed says, probably, if he can figure out what caused it. This is another example that combines Zed's pride with his competence. Zed does not yet know the source of the problem, but during his life he has learned so many different things about medicine that he's confident all he has to do is match the source of his condition with the correct part of his medical expertise. Zed makes a dad joke about Kaylin not being a girl or his friend when Richard says Kaylin isn't his girlfriend. Zed laughs at his own joke, another example of how Zed's sense of identity only revolves around his own appraisal. Zed recognizes what Kaylin is and becomes angry, pulling his hand away, and when he tries to tell Richard what she is, Kaylin lets him know with her body language that that would be a big mistake. Because of the knowledge in the Book of Counted Shadows, Richard already knew that a confessor was closely tied to the Boxes of Orden. But he does not learn that Kaylin is a confessor until she tells him in chapter 34 after their encounter with Shota. The author habitually links behavior that breaks a wizard's rule with negative consequences. When Kaylin makes her sense of self-worth dependent upon what Richard thinks of her, Kaylin keeps information from the people that are trying to help her to protect her own insecurities, and Zed, the rightful owner of the book, is kept from finding it. Zed would have quickly figured out that Richard has the gift because he is able to remember the words of the text, as mentioned in the last chapter of the book. Richard interrupts the exchange between them and tells Zed that Kaylin is his friend and that she has saved his life several times in the last 24 hours. Zed is presented with a choice when Richard asks for his help. When Zed shows reluctant body language, Richard adds that a quad was looking for Kaylin, and even though they got away, she was still in danger. We later learn that Richard was testing Zed with this question, and Goodkind leaves 2 clues for us to deduce that Richard is testing a theory about Zed. It mentions Richard's attention to Zed's eyes before he mentions the quad, and says that he saw what he was looking for when he saw hatred for the quad translate into empathy for Kaylin, a reference to his wife and daughter who were killed. Rather than challenge Zed directly emotionally, Richard introduces new rational information designed to humanize Kaylin and get Zed to snap back into a more rational state of mind. The author describes this transformation by saying that Zed looked to Kaylin as if he were seeing her for the first time. Zed has not yet accepted Kaylin on Richard's word alone, but he does listen to his friend's appeal to reason. Zed opens his mind when he sees evidence of Kaylin's mental state combined with Richard's word as a symbolic representation of integrity. Zed releases the emotional attack that was clouding his reason and views her as a human being instead of a faceless threat. Zed tells Kaylin that she will be safe here and invites her into his home to listen to their troubles and tend to Richard's fever. During this interaction, Zed displays an internalization of the 1st, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th Wizard's rules during the span of this conversation. In the interest of time, I will leave it to you to seek that knowledge and post your theories about which rules were displayed where in the comments below. Kaylin says that she has never heard the name Zedekis Zul Zorander before, and Zed takes a moment to wink at the camera when he says he's sure that she hasn't. Zed asks Kaylin if she can cook, and she says if Zed helps Richard that she will make him a big pot of spice soup. Zed also implies that Richard had better move faster before he is unable to move at all, stressing the very real danger posed by Richard's condition. The author mentions that Richard is able to feel his pulse pounding in his hand. The medical term for this is called a bounding pulse. Stress and hypertension are both linked to bounding pulse, and an article from the U.S. National Library of Medicine titled Sepsis-Related Hypertensive Response claims the occurrence of acute arterial hypertension during the early stages of some sepsis-related conditions and states that this is not uncommon. Zed leads them to a nearby outdoor table and brings all of them a collection of healthy snacks along with some apple juice. Given the lack of refrigeration, DoesItGoBad.com ranks homemade apple juice and fresh berries as items that should be consumed on the same day they are made or gathered. This tells us a little bit about the habits of Zed's daily routine. Since we never learn about Zed owning a milk-producing animal, it's safe to assume that he purchased the cheese from a nearby town. Since he has fresh apple juice that is ready to drink without in-home refrigeration, it is very likely that part of Zed's morning routine is the gathering of basic food items from nearby natural sources, and that he is in the habit of regularly preparing fresh apple juice for himself in much the same way that many people prepare fresh coffee or tea for themselves. Zed gives Richard a mug of something that smells like almonds and tells him to drink it, and asks Richard to tell him about the trouble he is in. I've got a gut feeling about the drink that Zed gave Richard. Given that after he drinks it, he falls asleep rather quickly, it is heavily implied that the drink was medicinal. However, we're never told what is in the drink that Zed gave Richard. Having read Goodkind's novels as many times as I have, at certain points I sometimes feel the way that Richard does in Soul of the Fire when he references Kolo's tendency to express certain information in certain ways. The word almonds stands out. While it is possible that Zed has access to almonds and was using it to somehow flavor Richard's drink, it seems unlikely that he would go through all that trouble to make Richard's medicine taste like almonds, especially given that he said himself time was very short. We only get 3 pieces of information to describe this beverage. It is brown in color, thick in texture, and smells of almonds. Richard's symptoms are fever, inflammation, high blood pressure, and sepsis. It is likely that whatever is in the drink is meant to help with those symptoms until Zed can find a cure for the root of the problem. My best guess is there are 4 main ingredients that make up the drink that Zed gave Richard. Willow bark tea for his fever and inflammation, which is a burgundy color. Magnolia bark tea to put him to sleep, which produces a grayish-brown color. Combined, those explain the brown color of the drink. Honey to give it a thick texture and to cover up the bitter taste of the willow bark and magnolia bark. Zed is frequently described as having a habit of adding honey to his drinks. And cyanide, which makes it smell like almonds. The online Mendelian Inheritance in Men is a collection of genetically inherited trait claims that initial studies, reviewed by Stern in 1960, showed male-female tendencies and family data consistent with X-linked recessive inheritance of inability to smell cyanide, meaning only a small percentage of the population has the genetic ability to smell the almond smell of cyanide. Yes, I am fairly convinced that Zed gave Richard cyanide as part of his medical treatment, because on occasion it is used in emergency medical situations to produce a rapid decrease in blood pressure in humans. It's also used as a vasodilator in vascular research. Given the amount of time the author spends building credibility into Zed's medical skills, it is likely that Zed would be aware of this interaction and would have recognized that this specific situation could be helped by what is normally considered a fatal poison. Zed's access to cyanide could very easily be explained by his tendency to make apple juice, as cyanide can be processed from leftover apple seeds. The core reasoning for this deduction is that unless the author was feeling whimsical and decided that a smell of almonds would make for good flavor text, he meant something when he chose those words. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Did Zed give Richard cyanide? Next, we're told by the author that Zed is the type of person who takes in every detail, assuming nothing and taking nothing for granted. This character trait would explain how Richard knew that giving Zed new information was the fastest way to get him to agree to help Kaylin. We're also reminded again that Kaylin does not like cheese. We later learn in Chapter 6 of Stone of Tears that Kaylin's aversion to cheese stems from a childhood trauma surrounding illness and cheese. Zed asks Richard why he was so close to the boundary, and Richard tells him it was to look for a vine that matched the one he found in his father's home. When Zed asks what the vine looked like, Richard pulls the piece he had in his pocket and shows it to him. Zed identifies it as a snake vine, and Richard recalls the name from information he has access to as a keeper of the secret book mentioned several times previously. Zed says that now that he knows how Richard was injured, he will be able to help him if he can find the root that he needs, and asks Kaylin to tell her side of the story, but asks her to keep it short. Kaylin produces the mother of all plot summaries when she says Darkenral, son of Panisral, has put the boxes of Orden into play, and that she is looking for the old wizard. We learn that the secret book is called the Book of Counted Shadows, and that Richard is keeping the knowledge of that book in his mind. He recalls the section of the book that references the snake vine starting to grow as a sign that the boxes of Orden have been put into play. For the second chapter in a row, Goodkind ends with Richard experiencing dread. This time is about what it means to have the events he learned about in the Book of Counted Shadows coming to pass. It's time for the official #1 quote from Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth in Wizard's First Rule, Chapter 6. Please note that the views and opinions of what the official #1 quote for this chapter is may differ from the views and opinions expressed by you about what your #1 quote from this chapter is. In the event that your #1 quote is different from the one mentioned here, please list your candidate for #1 quote in the comments below. And the official #1 quote is, "You have a fever," he pronounced. "Did you bring me anything to eat?" In the next chapter, we learn the secret of Richard's relationship with his father and the Book of Counted Shadows, as well as Zed's treatment of Richard's condition. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you feel like you've gotten something of value from this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you really liked it, I ask that you share a link to this video with those of you who you think might enjoy it as well. If those feelings are not there yet, I invite you to come back for the next episode and give me a chance to try and change your mind. Thanks for watching. My name is Tom, and I've been your guide. This has been Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. Come and join me next time so that while I am seeking these truths, you can become seekers.